Consumer Media's Mining Weekly is speaking to Paul Miller, the director and founder of AmaranthCX, on the worsening news for South Africa on the exploration front. Paul, in spite of the oft-quoted wishes about attracting 5% of the global exploration budget in 5 years, those 5 years keep extending out, and the South African percentage of the global budget keeps shrinking. What do the latest global exploration budget trends show?
Yes, Martin, it's not a happy story, I'm afraid. So it was in the State of the Nation debate of February 2019 when Minister Mantashe, at least it's the first reference I can find, announced that South Africa's aim was to attract 5% of global exploration spend from the 1% at the time within 3 to 5 years. So if he said that in February 2019, and we're now 2.5 years, in fact, more than 2.5 years since 2019, how are we doing on taking our exploration spend from 1% to 5%? Now, he could only have been referring to the S&P Intelligence, what's now called S&P Capital IQ Services numbers, because they're the only people who measure global exploration relative one country to the other. So I took a look at the numbers. Now, in 2004, South Africa attracted 5% of global exploration. It declined to where in 2019 it was about 1% of global exploration. And that must have been the number the minister was referring to. Unfortunately, his efforts have failed because we are now, in 2021, halfway to his target at 0.76% of global exploration. So we've actually, on a relative basis, declined from just on 1% to just on 0.76%, an 18% decline in the time that the minister had set to take it from 1% to 5%. Now, to give you some perspective, if we were to attract 5% of global exploration, we would have to attract between 6.5 and 8.5 billion rand a year in exploration spending. We're doing just more than $1 billion at the moment. So it's a 5-fold or 6-fold increase that we would require in our current exploration spending. Now, the question is, what actions were taken between when he set the target and 2.5 years later, which is halfway to the target? And I'm afraid I haven't seen any at all.
And why is it, Paul, that our neighbors, Botswana and Namibia, are continuing to knock South Africa into a cocked hat when it comes to attracting exploration investment?
Well, it's interesting because these countries, as geologically endowed as they are, have tiny populations, they have tiny economies, and yet collectively, Botswana and Namibia now attract more exploration budgets than South Africa does, with a vastly bigger mining industry. So, in fact, the numbers are around $10 million more exploration budgets than South Africa attracts. And congratulations to Botswana and Namibia, because they've had a look around the world, they've seen what best practice is, and they've implemented it. So what we see in Botswana, for example, no corruption, starting point. Secondly, they allow explorers who discover deposits to own 100% of the asset. They don't require national ownership in excess of 30% as we do. And they have a policy over many decades of retaining geological data at the relinquishment of a prospecting right or a prospecting license, and then making that data available to newcomers who want to also have a look. So what you see is this cumulative effect of more and more data or knowledge being generated by every explorer, being reinvested in the country's geological endowment and then used again. So, for example, I've seen De Beers has done decades of exploration in Botswana for diamonds, but that geophysical data is available to the next party who might want to look for base metals, for example. So they've cumulatively, over time, gathered all that information. Likewise in Namibia. In Namibia, if you don't spend money on your prospecting right, you lose your prospecting right. And that's not something that happens in South Africa. In South Africa, we routinely issue prospecting rights contrary to the law to parties who do not have either the money or the skills and experience to implement the prospecting right. And then they hold that prospecting right initially for 8 years, and then on a never-ending renewal process. You remember, renewals are not being processed through the department. So you hold your prospecting right on the never. So we're not reinvesting in our geological endowment, we're not generating knowledge, and we're not turning the properties over. So, I mean, that's a quick summary of why I think Namibia and Botswana are deservedly doing much better than the much bigger mining industry south of the border.
And so what must South Africa do to reverse this hugely negative downward trend?
Well, first of all, if you set a target in February 2019 to achieve something within 5 years, you shouldn't then in 2020 repeat the same target. So the minister has said in 2019 that in 5 years we would have, in fact, he said 3 to 5 years, he'd want to attract 5% of spend. You then do nothing except re-announce or walk forward the target at every further opportunity. So most recently was in October this year when he repeated that he wanted to achieve 5% in 5 years. It's not a target if you just keep walking it forward. What are we going to do? Say next year we want to achieve 5% in 5 years. And then, of course, take no action. You've got to actually reform a broken system. So we know that we've gone from 5% of global exploration to 1%. It was 35% of African exploration to less than 8% of African exploration. What it says is the grand compromise between incumbent miners, big government and big labor that was the original MPRDA and the original mining charter, firstly had no voice in it for explorers. It had no voice in the debate for mines that hadn't been built yet. And now, after all these years, we realize that the MPRDA and the charter does not make South Africa a competitive environment to attract exploration spending. I mean, the statistics are there. Not only S&P Capital IQ statistics that just show a year-on-year decline to now the 0.76% of global exploration, but the South African Reserve Bank's own data shows that South African companies are spending less on mineral exploration and evaluation than at any time since 1994. So I don't know what more evidence you need to say that the MPRDA and the Charter fails to attract exploration investment. Now, we can have big debates about where funding should come from. The fact is you've got to compete for funding, and we've got to take it from 1.5 billion rand approximately to about 8 billion rand. So government can create exploration funds of 100 million rand here or there. It's a rounding error in an effort to go from 1.5 billion to about 8 billion in spending.
And so where will South African mining end up if this trend is not reversed?
I've often asked rooms full of experienced mining people that very question, and I say to them, how many long life mines that currently operate will still be operating in 15 years' time? And generally, everyone can think of a few. I mean, Mogalakwena clearly will be operating, Amandelbult will be operating, Venetia will be operating. And you can start counting the mines. And remember, we've got about 400 or 500 commercial non-industrial minerals mines, right? If you start counting them up, I've not yet met anyone who off the top of their head can identify with all the fingers on their hands more than 10 mines that will still be operating 15 or 20 years into the future. And we also know that the global standard now of taking a tier 1 deposit from discovery to full production is between 10 and 20 years. So what will we have in 10 or 20 years? Well, we'll have less than the fingers on my hands of long life operating mines left. So any graduate entering the profession today can expect to be unemployed from about the age of 40. That is what happens in a mining industry by definition is a declining industry. Every mine on the day it opens is in decline until the day it closes. And the only way of sustaining the industry is through exploration, discovery of new deposits, and building new mines to replace those that have been mined out. We know from the statistics that exploration spending in South Africa has collapsed. Inevitably, that means in 10 to 20 years, only the very longest life mines will still be operating. The rest are going to close, and there's nothing to replace them. So I cannot recommend to any 18-year-old in South Africa who wants to remain employed past the age of 40 to enter the mining industry. Not until we see significant additional investment in upfront greenfields exploration. And there's nothing in our policy environment that suggests that's going to happen.
That was Creamer Media's Mining Weekly, speaking to Paul Miller, the director and founder of AmaranthCX.